Number 1. John List, the dark shadow behind the curtains of a Victorian mansion. In the quiet, affluent suburb of Westfield, New Jersey, the imposing Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue stood as a silent sentinel to a horrifying secret that would remain buried for nearly 18 years, a secret that stemmed in the mind of a man who appeared to be the very picture of respectability and piety. John Emil List was a man who prided himself on his adherence to the strictures of his Lutheran faith, a devoted father, a loving husband, and a successful accountant. Yet beneath this meticulously crafted veneer lay a crumbling financial empire and a psyche so fractured that he would justify the slaughter of his entire family as a necessary act of salvation. To understand the horror that unfolded on November 9th, 1971, one must first peel back the layers of List's life, examining the crushing weight of expectations, the desperate financial ruin, and the religious fanaticism that converged to create one of the most perplexing and cold-blooded family annihilation cases in American history. Born in 1925 into a strict German-American family in Bay City, Michigan, List was raised with an iron fist by his father, John Frederick List, a man who instilled in his son a profound fear of failure and a rigid adherence to moral absolutes. This upbringing forged a personality that was outwardly controlled and disciplined, but inwardly riddled with anxiety and a deep-seated need for perfection. List excelled academically, earning a degree in business administration and a master's in accounting from the University of Michigan, before serving as a lieutenant in the United States Army during World War II, though he never saw combat. Upon his return, he married Helen Morris Taylor, a woman with a somewhat troubled past, including a previous marriage and a struggle with alcoholism, which List viewed as his personal mission to rectify through prayer and discipline. The couple settled in Rochester, New York, where List began a career as an accountant and an instructor at a local college. But his ambition and his desire to maintain a facade of upper-class respectability drove him to seek greater financial success and social standing. This quest for status eventually led the family to Westfield, New Jersey, and the purchase of a 19-room Victorian mansion known as Breeze Knoll, a home that was far beyond their means but served as a tangible symbol of the success List so desperately craved. The house was a monstrosity of maintenance, with high ceilings, drafty rooms, and a heating bill that bled List's finances dry. Yet he refused to downsize, viewing the home as a testament to his achievement. However, by the late 1960s, List's professional life began to unravel. He was fired from his position as an accountant at a bank in Trenton, and subsequently failed to establish a successful private practice. As his income dried up, the debts mounted, and the fear of being exposed as a fraud began to consume him. He stopped paying the mortgage, the utilities, and the taxes, yet he continued to leave the house every morning dressed in a suit and carrying a briefcase, pretending to go to work, while in reality, he spent his days at the train station or the library, too ashamed to admit his failure to his family. This period of deceit coincided with deepening of his religious fervor. List became a devout member of the Redeemer Lutheran Church, attending services multiple times a week and immersing himself in the scriptures. But his interpretation of the Bible was twisted and fatalistic, focusing heavily on the concepts of sin, judgment, and the preservation of the soul at the cost of the flesh. As his financial world collapsed around him, List began to view his family situation through a distorted theological lens. He believed that his financial failure was a test from God, but more disturbingly, he began to fear for the spiritual salvation of his wife, Helen, and his 3 children. Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. Helen's alcoholism, which had been a source of friction for years, had worsened, compounded by untreated syphilis contracted from her first husband that was now affecting her mental state. List, unable to cope with the shame of her condition and the financial ruin she inadvertently contributed to through her medical bills, began to rationalize that death would be a release for her and a way to save her soul from further sin. Similarly, he worried about his children, believing that the disgrace of poverty and the potential scandal of his financial crimes would lead them astray. His mother, Alma, who lived with him in the mansion, was elderly and infirm, and List coldly calculated that she could no longer care for herself and that it was his duty to end her suffering. Over a period of weeks in October and early November 1971, John List meticulously planned the murders of his entire family, a process that involved a chilling level of premeditation. He ordered several handguns, including a 9mm Star pistol and a .22 caliber revolver, and practiced his aim at a local firing range. He also opened a new bank account under a false name and secured a post office box where he could have mail forwarded, laying the groundwork for his escape. He canceled the milk delivery, the newspaper, and the window cleaning service, ensuring that no one would come to the house and discover the bodies prematurely. He even notified his children's schools and the Michigan branch of the bank where his mother received her pension that the family would be visiting relatives for an extended period, fabricated a lie that would buy him weeks of freedom before the alarm was raised. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, the plan was set in motion. List waited until his children had left for school and his wife was upstairs in her bedroom. He retrieved his weapons and began his grim work. His first victim was his mother, Alma List. He found her in her third-floor bedroom and shot her once in the head, killing her instantly. He then dragged her body to the ballroom on the third floor and laid her out on a sleeping bag, crossing her hands over her chest in a pose of peaceful repose, a grotesque attempt to show respect even as he committed the ultimate act of disrespect. Next, he went to master bedroom where his wife, Helen, was resting. According to the detailed confession he would write years later, he shot her once above the eye, but the bullet did not kill her immediately. In a panic, he shot her again, ending her life. Like his mother, he dragged her body to the ballroom, placed her on a sleeping bag, and positioned her hands. He then cleaned up the blood in the bedroom, meticulously wiping away any trace of the violence to preserve the scene for when it would be found. List then waited for his children to return home from school. Patricia, age 16, arrived first. She was a bright, artistic girl who had recently begun to question her father's strict authority and had shown interest in the counterculture movement of the time, a fact that undoubtedly fueled List's fears that she was straying from the righteous path. He called her into the ballroom under the pretense of needing help with something, and as she walked in, he shot her in the back of the head. She fell near her mother's body. List then placed her on a sleeping bag and covered her with a coat. Frederick, age 15, arrived home next. He was a reserved boy, close to his father, and a member of the school's ROTC. List shot him in the head and chest multiple times, perhaps sensing that Frederick, with his military training, might oppose a threat or simply because the act of killing his son required more force to overcome his own hesitation. Finally, 13-year-old John Jr. came home. List shot him in the head and chest as he entered the house. In a final macabre ritual, List placed all three children beside their mother and grandmother, carefully arranging their bodies and closing their eyes. He turned on all the lights in the ballroom and tuned a radio to a religious station, filling the silent house with the sounds of hymns. Before leaving, List sat down at his desk in the study and wrote a letter to his pastor, explaining his actions. He wrote that he believed he had to save his family from the shame and sin that poverty and disgrace would bring, claiming that he killed them out of love and a desire to send them to heaven before they could be tainted by the world. He also wrote a letter to his boss, resigning from a job he had already lost, and a letter to his father, who had been dead for years, apologizing for his failures. With the letters stacked neatly on the desk, List packed a few changes of clothes, his weapons, and the family's valuables into his car. He drove to the airport in Newark, abandoned his car, and caught a flight to Detroit. From there, he began a journey that would take him across the country, eventually landing in Denver, Colorado, where he would adopt a new identity and start a new life, leaving behind a house of horrors that would not be discovered for nearly a month. The discovery of the List family murders on December 7th, 1971, sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Westfield and triggered a massive manhunt that would span decades and frustrate investigators at every turn. The bodies were found when neighbors, alarmed by the accumulation of newspapers on the porch and the lack of activity in the house, contacted the police. When officers forced their way into the mansion, they found it eerily silent, with the lights still blazing in the ballroom and the radio still playing hymns. The sight that greeted them was one of surreal horror. 5 bodies laid out in a row, as if in a funeral parlor, surrounded by the opulent but decaying grandeur of the Victorian mansion. The initial investigation was swift, but immediately confounded by the absence of the father. Investigators found the letters on John List's desk, which provided a clear motive and a confession of sorts, but they also revealed a calculated plan to escape. The letters, while explaining List's warped religious rationale, also served as a taunt to the authorities, signaling that this was not a crime of passion, but a carefully orchestrated disappearance. The police launched a nationwide search, circulating List's description and fingerprints to every law enforcement agency in the country. They tracked his movements from Newark to Detroit and then to Colorado, where they discovered he had rented a car and driven to a job placement agency. However, the trail went cold in Denver. List had been meticulous in covering his tracks. He had used his military training to understand how to evade detection, sticking to cash transactions, avoiding major transportation hubs that required ID, and staying in inexpensive motels that did not ask for registration details. He also changed his appearance, shaving his beard and wearing glasses. The FBI placed List on their 10 most wanted fugitives list, and his case was featured on television shows like America's Most Wanted, but for years, he remained a ghost. The psychological profile of List created by FBI experts suggested that he was unlikely to reoffend violently, as his crime was specific to his family situation, but that he would likely attempt to reinvent himself as a respectable citizen, maintaining his conservative values and rigid personality in a new context. This prediction proved to be eerily accurate. In 1973, 2 years after the murders, John List was living in Denver under the alias Robert P. Clark. He had secured a job as an accountant at a trucking company, a position that utilized his skills but required little personal interaction. He eventually moved to Midlothian, Virginia, a suburb of Richmond, where he continued to live as Robert Clark. In an astonishing twist of fate, List met Dolores Miller, a widow with 3 children, at church. True to his pattern, he courted her with the utmost propriety, presenting himself as a devout, financially stable, and kind-hearted man. They married in 1985. For nearly 18 years, John List lived a quiet, unassuming life as Robert Clark. He was a model citizen, attending church regularly, paying his bills on time, and never drawing attention to himself. His new wife had no idea that the man sleeping beside her was a mass murderer who had executed his entire family. However, the long arm of the law finally caught up with him in 1989, thanks in large part to the advent of forensic age regression technology and the persistence of true crime enthusiasts. A segment on America's Most Wanted featured the List case, and forensic artists had created a bust showing what List might look like nearly 2 decades after crime. A neighbor in Virginia saw the broadcast and recognized the face as that of Robert Clark, the quiet accountant who lived down the street. She contacted the authorities, and the FBI began surveillance on List. They matched his fingerprints to those found at the crime scene in Westfield, confirming beyond a doubt that Robert Clark was indeed John List. On June 1, 1989, just days before his 64th birthday, John List was arrested at his office in Richmond. He did not resist. When the agents approached him, he simply asked, "What took you so long?" The subsequent extradition to New Jersey and the legal proceedings that followed became a media spectacle. List was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. His defense team, acknowledging the overwhelming evidence against him, focused on an insanity defense, arguing that List suffered from a depressive disorder that rendered him unable to appreciate the criminality of his actions at the time of the murders. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about List's strict upbringing, his obsessive-compulsive personality, and his deep-seated fear of failure, painting a picture of a man who snapped under the pressure of maintaining a facade. The prosecution, however, dismantled this argument by highlighting the meticulous planning involved. They pointed to the cancellation of services, the opening of the post office box, the purchase of the weapons, and the detailed letters left behind as evidence of premeditation and rational thought. They argued that List was not insane, but rather a cold, calculating narcissist who believed he was above the law and had the right to play God with his family's lives. After a lengthy trial, the jury deliberated for a short time before rejecting the insanity defense. On May 1, 1990, John List was found guilty on all 5 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life terms in prison, ensuring that he would never be released. List showed little emotion during the sentencing, maintaining his stoic demeanor until the end. He was transferred to the Trenton State Prison, where he spent the rest of his life. In the years following his conviction, List gave several interviews from prison, attempting to justify his actions by reiterating his belief that he had saved his family from the devil and the shame of poverty. He expressed remorse for the pain he caused, but maintained that he did what he thought was right at the time. He never admitted to being wrong in his religious conviction, only sorry that circumstances had forced his hand. The house where murders took place, Breeze Knoll, stood empty for many years, a rotting reminder of the tragedy, before being destroyed by a fire in 1972 and eventually demolished. John List died of complications from pneumonia on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82, while still in prison custody. His case remains one of the most disturbing examples of family annihilation because it challenges the stereotype of the violent criminal. List was not a drug addict, a career criminal, or a man with a history of violence. He was an ordinary man who, when faced with the collapse of his carefully constructed world, chose to obliterate the source of his shame rather than face it. The legacy of John List is a cautionary tale about the dangers of repressed emotions, the destructive power of religious fanaticism, and the terrifying capability of a human being to rationalize the unforgivable. It also serves as a testament to the advances in forensic science and the persistence of law enforcement, proving that even the most carefully planned escapes can eventually be undone by a single recognizable face. For the families of the victims, the closure came late, but it came, and the community of Westfield, though scarred, was able to finally close the chapter on the dark shadow that had hung over Hillside Avenue for so long. The story of John List forces us to look beyond the surface of the people we think we know, to question the masks that people wear, and to acknowledge that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who live quietly behind the white picket fences of suburban America, hiding their darkness behind a veil of respectability and faith. Number 2, James Ruppert, the Easter Sunday massacre that erased a generation. The Ruppert family gathered at 635 Minor Avenue in Hamilton, Ohio, on April 13, 1975, with the intentions of celebrating a joyous Easter Sunday, a day traditionally reserved for resurrection and renewal, but instead a ham and festive cheer that usually accompanied their holiday gatherings. The house would become a slaughterhouse that witnessed the near-total extinction of a single branch of the Ruppert family tree in a span of less than 30 minutes. James Ruppert, a 41-year-old unemployed man who lived in the basement of his mother's home, sat at the center of this family dynamic, a ticking time bomb of resentment, jealousy, and perceived failure that would eventually explode into one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history at the time. To understand the mechanism of this tragedy, one must look into the bleak existence of James Ruppert, a man who had spent his adult life drifting through a series of dead-end jobs, failed marriages, and financial dependencies that chipped away at his self-worth until nothing remained but a festering hatred for the brother who had succeeded where he had failed. While James floundered, his younger brother, Leonard Ruppert Jr., had built a life that mirrored the American dream. He had a stable job, a beautiful wife, also named Alma, and a sprawling, vibrant family of 8 children who filled the house with noise and life. This stark contrast between the two brothers was a source of a deep-seated pathology in James, who felt emasculated by his reliance on their elderly mother, Alma Ruppert, for shelter and basic sustenance. The house at 635 Minor Avenue was a modest structure, but was bulging at the seams with the energy of Leonard's large family, a constant reminder to James of his own barren existence. As the holiday approached, the pressure cooker at James's psyche began to rattle. He had recently received a notice from the bank regarding his overdue car payments, a minor financial hiccup for many, but a devastating blow to a man who had nothing else. He feared his mother would ask him to leave the basement, a prospect that terrified him more than death, as it would signify his final expulsion from the family unit and total failure as a man. On that fateful Sunday morning, the air in the house was thick with the smell of cooking food and the sounds of children playing, but James was withdrawn, nursing his grievances in the shadows of the basement, while the rest of the family prepared for the feast. He had made a decision, a dark and irrevocable choice to resolve his problems through the only means of control he felt he had left: violence. Sometime before the family sat down to eat, James retrieved 2 firearms he had purchased legally in the months prior, a .357 Magnum revolver and a .22 caliber rifle. He loaded them with a cold detachment, his mind already visualizing the trajectory of the bullets that would soon tear through the bodies of the people he both loved and loathed. The massacre began in the kitchen, the heart of the home, where the women of the family were likely busy preparing the last of the dishes. James emerged from the basement, his face a mask of stoic resolve, and without uttering a word, he raised a .357 Magnum and shot his 71-year-old mother, Alma, at point-blank range. She fell instantly, the matriarch of the family extinguished by the son she had sheltered. The sound of the gunshot shattered the festive atmosphere, causing panic and confusion among the family members who were gathered in the dining room and living area. Leonard Ruppert Jr., likely acting on instinct to protect his family, rushed toward the source of the gunfire, but James was ready for him. He turned the revolver on his brother and fired, striking him multiple times and ending his life before he could reach the shooter. By this time, the house was plunged into chaos. Leonard's wife, Alma, and the 8 children, ranging in age from 4-year-old Thomas to 17-year-old Leonard Jr., were screaming and scrambling for safety. James Ruppert, however, had sealed the exits in his mind and was methodical in his approach. He shot his sister-in-law as she tried to shield the younger children, her body falling beside her husband's. What followed was a scene of unmitigated horror. As James turned his attention to the children, the living symbols of his brother's success and his own inadequacy, he hunted them through the house, the sound of the .357 Magnum booming like thunder in enclosed spaces. Some of the children tried to hide in closets or under beds, while others attempted to flee out the back door. 17-year-old Leonard Jr. was shot in the yard as he tried to run for help, his body crumpling on the grass. Inside, James continued his grim work, shooting the younger children where they cowered. Teresa, age 16, and age 15, were found together in a bedroom, huddled in fear when the bullets struck them down. Michael, 13, and John, 11, tried to barricade themselves in a room, but James kicked the door in and ended their lives with ruthless efficiency. Even the smallest children, 9-year-old Carol, 7-year-old James, and 4-year-old Thomas, were not spared. The sheer brutality of killing toddlers and infants speaks to the complete psychological disintegration of James Ruppert at that moment. He was no longer seeing family members, but merely obstacles to be removed or targets for his rage. In a matter of minutes, 11 lives were snuffed out. When the shooting stopped, the house was silent, save for the ringing in James's ears and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He stood amidst the carnage, surrounded by the bodies of his mother, his brother, his sister-in-law, and his 8 nieces and nephews. There was no one left to scream, no one left to judge him. In a bizarre coda to the violence, James did not immediately flee. Instead, he left the house and drove to a local tavern, where he sat calmly and had a drink, attempting to process the enormity of what he had just done. He eventually called the police from a friend's house, turning himself in without resistance. When officers arrived at the scene on Minor Avenue, they were met with a tableau of death that would haunt even the most seasoned veterans of the force. Bodies were scattered throughout the kitchen, living room, and bedrooms, and the yard outside. The investigation that followed was technically straightforward due to the lack of any attempt to hide the crime, but the motive was a subject of intense psychological scrutiny. James Ruppert confessed to the killings almost immediately, but his explanation varied, shifting between claims of self-defense against a family that was conspiring to institutionalize him to a vague assertion that he just snapped under the pressure of his debts and his mother's nagging. The prosecution, however, painted a picture of a calculated killer motivated by pathological jealousy and a desire for revenge against a brother who had made him feel small. The trial of James Ruppert captivated and horrified the nation, as the details of the Easter Sunday massacre emerged in grisly detail. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all trying to fathom how a man could murder his own flesh and blood in such a cold-blooded manner. The defense argued that James was not guilty by reason of insanity, citing his long history of depression, his paranoid belief that the family was against him, and the dissociative state he claimed to have been in during the shooting. Psychiatrists testified for the defense, detailing James's low self-esteem, his feelings of emasculation, and his inability to cope with the normal stresses of life. They argued that his mind had broken, that he was unable to distinguish right from wrong at the moment of the crime. The prosecution countered with their own experts, who testified that while James may have been depressed and angry, he fully understood the nature of his actions. They pointed to the fact that he had purchased the weapons in advance, that he had targeted specific individuals, and that he had the presence of mind to flee the scene and contact the police. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, rejecting the insanity defense. James Ruppert was found guilty of 11 counts of aggravated murder. In the penalty phase, the jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge sentenced him to die in the electric chair. However, James Ruppert would cheat the executioner, not through death, but through the evolving legal landscape of the United States. In 1978, Ohio's death penalty statute was ruled unconstitutional, and the death sentences of everyone on death row, including Ruppert, were commuted to life in prison. This legal twist meant that James Ruppert would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, a prospect that seemed to bother him very little. He was transferred to the Ohio Penitentiary and later to the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, where he settled into a routine of incarceration. For decades, he remained a notorious figure, the man who had wiped out almost his entire family in a single afternoon of fury. He gave few interviews and expressed little remorse, often maintaining that he was a victim of a family that did not understand him. The community of Hamilton, Ohio, struggled to heal from the trauma. The house on Minor Avenue was eventually torn down, replaced by a park, a physical erasure of the site of so much pain. The surviving members of the extended Ruppert family were left to grapple with the incomprehensible loss of so many loved ones, their family tree sheared off by one of its own branches. James Ruppert died in prison on February 15, 2019, at the age of 85, having spent 44 years behind bars for his crimes. He took the secrets of his final moments with his mother and brother to the grave, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most prolific family annihilators in American history. His story serves as a grim reminder of the destructive power of unchecked envy and the tragic consequences when mental illness and toxic masculinity intersect with lethal weaponry. The Easter Sunday massacre remains a stain on the history of Hamilton, a day when celebration turned to slaughter, and a man named James Ruppert chose to resolve his petty grievances by ending the lives of 11 people who had the misfortune to be his family. Number 3. Christian Longo, a fugitive father hiding in the shadows of paradise. The story of Christian Michael Longo is a harrowing narrative of a life built entirely on fraud, a cascading series of deceptions that culminated in the brutal murders of his wife and 3 young children on the rugged coast of Oregon in December 2001. A crime that shocked the nation not only for its brutality, but for the audacity of the perpetrator's escape attempt and the bizarre identity theft that followed. Longo was a man who projected an image of success and domestic bliss, but beneath the polished surface lay a pathological liar and a thief who stole hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. And when the walls of his deception began to close in, he chose to silence his family rather than face the consequences of his actions. Born on January 23, 1974, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, Longo exhibited signs of his deceptive nature early in life, dabbling in petty theft and insurance fraud as a teenager, actions that served as a precursor to the grand scale of his adult criminality. He married Mary Jane Longo, a woman devoted to him and their growing family, and together they had 3 children, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. To the outside world, they were a handsome, photogenic family, often attending church and appearing to thrive in their close-knit community. However, the reality was a financial house of cards held together by forged checks and stolen identities. Longo would purchase luxury items, boats, and cars using funds he siphoned from construction companies he worked for and various fraudulent schemes. As his debts mounted and the law began to nip at his heels, the Longos moved frequently, fleeing from Michigan to Ohio and eventually to the West Coast, trying to stay one step ahead of creditors and the police. By late 2001, they had landed in Newport, Oregon, a picturesque coastal town where Longo hoped to disappear completely. They rented a condominium at the waterfront complex called The Landing, a place that should have symbolized a new beginning, but would instead become a tomb. The pressure on Longo was immense. His car was repossessed. He was facing felony fraud charges, and his wife, Mary Jane, was beginning to ask difficult questions about their finances and their future. In the mind of a narcissist like Longo, his family was no longer a source of comfort but a liability, a chain linking him to a life of failure and impending imprisonment. The meticulous planning of his family's execution mirrored the calculated nature of his financial crimes. The murders occurred over a span of several days just before Christmas 2001. Longo first killed his wife, Mary Jane, and his youngest daughter, 2-year-old Madison. He later claimed that an argument had turned physical, but the forensic evidence suggested a much colder, more methodical act. He stuffed their bodies into suitcases and weights, dumping them into the murky waters of the Yaquina Bay near the marina. A few days later, on December 19th, he took his older children, 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie, to the coast of Walport, Oregon, just a short drive south of Newport. There, at the Alsea Bay, he carried out the unthinkable. He weighed their small bodies down with pilings from a construction site and threw them into the cold, churning water. The sheer cruelty of murdering toddlers, looking into their eyes and ending their lives, speaks to a profound psychological void where empathy should have been. With his family eliminated, Longo embarked on a desperate flight to avoid capture. He stole a Dodge Durango from a car dealership and drove to San Francisco, where he sold a vehicle and purchased a plane ticket to Mexico. He flew to Cancun, a popular tourist destination, where he attempted to vanish into a crowd of backpackers and vacationers. It was here that the bizarre twist of Longo's story unfolded. Living in a beachside hostel, Longo passed himself off as Michael Finkel, a journalist for the New York Times. He had read articles by Finkel and adopted his identity, charming fellow travelers with stories of his life as a reporter. Meanwhile, back in Oregon, the horror began to unfold. The body of Zachary was discovered by a local resident in the slough at Walport on December 19th, followed shortly by Sadie. The discovery of 2 small children, dressed in pajamas and weighed down, triggered a massive FBI manhunt for their parents. When Mary Jane and Madison's suitcases surfaced in Yaquina Bay on December 22nd and 27th, the focus shifted entirely to Christian Longo as the prime suspect. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. The investigation was a race against time, as agents tracked Longo's credit card usage and flight manifests, eventually pinpointing his location in Cancun. In a stroke of incredible luck for the authorities, a group of tourists at a beach club in Tulum recognized Longo from a segment on America's Most Wanted. They alerted the FBI, who coordinated with Mexican authorities to apprehend him. On January 13, 2002, Christian Longo was arrested by Mexican police at an internet cafe where he was emailing friends. He did not go quietly. He attempted to pose as a different person, but his cover was blown. He was extradited back to the United States to face charges of murders of his wife and children. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally charged. Longo initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, going so far as to blame his wife, Mary Jane, for the deaths of their children. He claimed that he had come home to find Zachary and Sadie dead in the apartment, and that Mary Jane had killed them, a claim that was categorically rejected by prosecutors and forensic evidence. The physical evidence proved that the children had been killed at the coast, not in the apartment, and that Mary Jane had been dead for days before the children were murdered. As the trial date approached and the weight of the DNA evidence and witness testimony mounted, Longo realized his chances of acquittal were non-existent. In a shocking move, he approached the prosecution with a deal. He offered to plead guilty to the murders of his wife and youngest daughter, Madison, and lead authorities to the location of Mary Jane's car, which had not been found, in exchange for prosecution not seeking the death penalty. The prosecution, seeking closure for family and certain conviction, accepted the offer. However, regarding the deaths of Zachary and Sadie, Longo maintained his innocence for a longer period, continuing to deflect blame onto Mary Jane. It was a strategic maneuver to spare his own life, a selfish final act from a man who had taken everything from his family. Ultimately, the truth came out in full during the sentencing phase. On April 16, 2003, Christian Longo pleaded guilty to 2 counts of aggravated murder for the deaths of Mary Jane and Madison. Several months later, in a separate hearing, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Zachary and Sadie, finally admitting his responsibility for the entire massacre. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, rejecting the prosecution's initial push for the death penalty in light of the plea agreement. The sentence also ordered him to pay restitution for the stolen funds and the cost of the investigation, a financial burden he will never be able to repay. Christian Longo is currently incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary. In a disturbing footnote to the case, Longo has maintained a presence in the media from behind bars, corresponding with journalists and even creating a website that profiles other inmates, a continuation of his desire for attention and his manipulation of narrative. The case of Christian Longo is often remembered not just for the tragic loss of 3 innocent children and their mother, but for the chilling contrast between the idyllic setting of the Oregon coast and the brutality of the crimes committed there. It serves as a stark warning about the destructive potential of living a lie. When the facade of a perfect life cracks, the pressure can shatter the psyche, leading those with no moral compass to destroy the witnesses to their failure. For friends and extended family of Mary Jane, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison, the pain is everlasting, a void left by a man who valued his freedom over the lives of his own flesh and blood. The narrative also spawned a strange cultural legacy, detailed in the book True Story by Michael Finkel, the real journalist whose identity Longo stole, and later adapted into a film, highlighting the surreal intersection of true crime and media manipulation. Longo remains a ghost in the system, alive but removed from the world, serving a sentence that can never truly match the gravity of his crimes against the helpless lives he was sworn to protect. Number 4. Robert William Fisher, the fugitive who vanished into thin air of the Arizona wilderness. In the early hours of April 10th, 2001, a massive explosion tore through a quiet neighborhood in Scottsdale, Arizona, reducing a 2-story home to a pile of smoking rubble and shattering the silence of the desert night with force that registered on seismographs miles away. What initially appeared to be a tragic gas leak accident quickly morphed into one of the most baffling and intensive manhunts in FBI history, when investigators discovered that the explosion was a calculated cover-up for a heinous crime, leaving behind 3 victims and a prime suspect who seemed to have walked off the face of the earth. Robert William Fisher, a former firefighter and Navy hospital corpsman, was the man at the center of this inferno, a devoted father and husband on the surface, but underneath, a man seething with rage, religious fanaticism, and a desire for control that ultimately led him to execute his entire family. Born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1961, Fisher's early life was marked by a strained relationship with his father, whom he despised for his strict discipline and later for his infidelity, which shattered the family unit. This upbringing instilled in Fisher a deep-seated resentment toward moral transgression and a rigid, albeit hypocritical, moral code that he would later use to justify his own actions. He joined the United States Navy, where he trained as a hospital corpsman, a role that gave him medical knowledge and familiarity with anatomy, skills that would later manifest in the brutality of his crimes. After his service, he married Mary Cooper, a woman he met in a hospital where they both worked, and they settled in Scottsdale, raising 2 children, Brittany and Bobby. To the outside world, the Fishers were the epitome of a middle-class American family. Robert worked as a surgical technician and later as a firefighter, professions that commanded respect and trust. He was active in his church, volunteered his time, and was known to be a stickler for rules and cleanliness. However, behind the closed doors of their home on North 74th Place, the atmosphere was far from idyllic. Fisher was controlling and emotionally abusive, isolating Mary from her friends and subjecting the children to harsh discipline. He was obsessed with appearances, demanding that the house be kept in perfect order and that his family adhere to his strict interpretation of Christian values. By early 2001, the marriage was crumbling under the weight of Fisher's controlling behavior and Mary's desire for independence. She had recently filed for divorce, a move that shattered Fisher's world and his ego. He viewed divorce as a sin and a personal failure, a betrayal of the vows he held sacred, and the prospect of losing control over his wife and children sent him into a psychological spiral. In the weeks leading up to the explosion, Fisher engaged in a disturbing pattern of preparation. He withdrew large sums of cash from the family bank accounts, purchased a .45 caliber handgun, and withdrew his children from school under guise of a family trip, telling friends and relatives they were going on a vacation to Florida or Iowa. Instead, he was planning their end. On the night of April 9th, 2001, the horror unfolded within the walls of the Scottsdale home. Fisher waited until Mary and the children were asleep, likely aided by the use of sleep-inducing medication found in their systems during the autopsy. His first victim was his wife, Mary. He shot her once in the back of the head as she lay in bed, a cowardly act that spared her any awareness of her fate. He then moved to the children's room. 10-year-old Brittany and 12-year-old Bobby were asleep in their bunk beds. Fisher shot Bobby in the head, but the bullet did not immediately kill him. In a frenzy of overkill that suggests complete loss of control or a desperate attempt to ensure no suffering could be testified to later, Fisher slit Bobby's throat. He then turned to Brittany, shooting her in the head and similarly slitting her throat. The brutality of the throat slittings, combined with the gunshot wounds, pointed to a rage that went far beyond a simple mercy killing. It was an act of obliteration, an attempt to wipe out the source of his pain and shame. Having extinguished the lives of his family, Fisher set the stage for his escape and the destruction of the evidence. He used his training as a firefighter to rupture the gas line in the house, allowing the flammable vapor to fill the rooms. He lit a single candle, perhaps a twisted symbol of vigil or a deliberate timer, and left the house. He retrieved the family's blue Toyota 4Runner and fled the scene. Moments later, the gas ignited, triggering the massive explosion that leveled the home and incinerated the bodies of Mary, Brittany, and Bobby, a final act of desecration. The manhunt for Robert Fisher was immediate and unprecedented in scale. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, replacing Osama bin Laden for a time as the most sought-after man in America. The investigation revealed a trail of clues that suggested Fisher had planned his flight with military precision. He had packed his camping gear, his weapons, and the cash he had withdrawn. The family's dog, a blue heeler named Blue, was found unharmed in the garage, spared by Fisher, perhaps the only living thing he felt mercy for, or perhaps simple logistical oversight. The breakthrough in the search came when Fisher's Toyota 4Runner was discovered abandoned in the dense forest near Young, Arizona, deep within the Tonto National Forest. The car was parked in a remote area, hidden from view, and inside, police found Fisher's camping equipment. His dog Blue still waiting loyally inside, and a rifle, but there was no sign of Fisher himself. A massive ground search ensued, involving hundreds of volunteers, bloodhounds, helicopters, and tracking teams. They combed the rugged terrain of the Mogollon Rim, a vast wilderness of deep canyons, thick forests, and dangerous cliffs. The search was grueling and hampered by bad weather. But despite the exhaustive efforts, no trace of Fisher was found. The prevailing theory was that Fisher, a survivalist with knowledge of the outdoors, had either succumbed to the elements, committed suicide in a remote crevice where his body would never be found, or managed to escape the dragnet and assume a new identity. Over the years, there were reported sightings of Fisher from Canada to Florida, each one investigated and ultimately debunked. The FBI pursued leads for over 2 decades, keeping the case active and the pressure on. Fisher became a ghost, a boogeyman in the true crime community, a symbol of the murderer who got away. However, the mystery of Robert Fisher took a final, grim turn in 2021. In a rugged area of the Coconino National Forest, not far from where his car had been abandoned 20 years prior, a hiker discovered human remains scattered in a shallow cave. The condition of the remains made identification difficult, but forensic anthropologists were able to recover DNA. For over a year, the results were pending until late 2022, when the Arizona Department of Public Safety confirmed that the DNA matched Robert William Fisher. Furthermore, the location of the remains, along with a small piece of the firearm he had used, confirmed that Fisher had not escaped to a new life in the tropics or Europe. He had died in the wilderness, likely by suicide, shortly after abandoning his car. He had crawled into a cave, perhaps injured, perhaps simply overcome by the weight of his deeds and the impossibility of escape, and ended his own life with the same weapon he had used on his family. The confirmation of his death brought a grim closure to the case, but it also reshaped the narrative. For 20 years, Fisher was viewed as an elusive mastermind on the run. In reality, he was a desperate man who died alone in the dirt, unable to face the consequences of his actions. The discovery of his body meant he would never stand trial for the murders of Mary, Brittany, and Bobby, denying the family the justice of conviction and the opportunity to look him in the eye. The legacy of Robert Fisher is a haunting reminder of the duality of human nature and the terrifying capacity of a man to destroy what he claims to love. His training to save lives was perverted into the knowledge of how to take them most efficiently. His desire for a perfect family led him to annihilate them rather than let them go. The explosion in Scottsdale was not just a destruction of a house, but an implosion of a man's psyche, leaving behind a scar on the landscape and a memory of a crime so brutal it defies comprehension. The forest that hid his secret for 2 decades finally gave him up, but the answers came too late to heal the wound he inflicted on his community and his memory. Number 5. Stephen Sweppel, the vice president of a bank who bludgeoned his family to death to hide the shame of embezzlement. In the affluent, quiet community of Iowa City, Iowa, where the rolling hills meet the academic atmosphere of the university, the Sweppel family was widely regarded as a beacon of success, charity, and devout Catholic faith, making the brutal discovery of their bodies on Easter Sunday 2008 a seismic shock that tore through the hard community and exposed the rotting foundation of a life built on lies. Stephen Sweppel was not a street-level thug or a drifter. He was a respected vice president of Hills Bank and Trust Company, a man entrusted with the financial security of his neighbors, a dedicated father to 4 adopted children, and a husband who appeared to worship the ground his wife, Cheryl, walked on. Yet, beneath this meticulously curated facade of suburban perfection, Stephen was spiraling into a psychological abyss of his own making, driven by a massive embezzlement scheme that was on the verge of exposing him as a fraud and destroying the legacy he had worked so hard to build. The story begins not with the violence of that fateful March weekend, but years earlier with the slow, corrosive drip of financial theft that Stephen Sweppel orchestrated against the very bank that employed him. As a vice president in the trust department, he had access to client accounts and the authority to move funds, a position of power that he violated repeatedly to siphon off nearly $560,000 over a period of several years. The money was used to fund a lifestyle that was theoretically already within his reach, but perhaps fueled by a hidden addiction to the thrill of theft or a desperate need to maintain an appearance of unassailable stability. He paid for private school tuition, home improvements, and family vacations with stolen money. By early 2008, the scheme was unraveling. Auditors at Hills Bank had discovered discrepancies, and federal authorities were closing in. Stephen was suspended from his job, and the grim reality of criminal charges, imprisonment, and total public humiliation loomed over him like a storm cloud. For a man who prided himself on his status and his standing in the church, the prospect of being led away in handcuffs was an unbearable fate. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Stephen's mental state deteriorated visibly. He made a bizarre and ominous suicide attempt in mid-March by crashing his car into a concrete barrier on Interstate 380, an act that was initially written off as an accident, but which, in hindsight, was the first scream of a soul in torment. Following the crash, he was hospitalized for a short period, but remarkably, he was allowed to return home to his wife and 4 children, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor, who were blissfully unaware of the magnitude of the legal and financial tidal wave bearing down on their father. Cheryl Sweppel, a woman described by friends as saintly and endlessly supportive, stood by her husband, likely believing that they could weather the storm through faith and restitution. She could not have known that the man sleeping beside her was not planning a legal defense, but a final horrific solution to his problems. The timeline of the murders is a chilling march toward the inevitable, occurring over the span of approximately 24 hours. On Saturday, March 22, 2008, Stephen Sweppel sent an email to his extended family and friends, a disturbing communication that hinted at his dark intentions. He included an attachment of his family obituary, a pre-written eulogy that celebrated their lives and asked for privacy in their time of grief. The recipients were confused and alarmed, but by the time they could process the meaning of the email, it was too late. Stephen had already begun the process of extinguishing the lives of the people who loved him most. The weapon he chose was a baseball bat, a symbol of American family pastime, turned into an instrument of slaughter. The violence did not happen all at once. Evidence suggests that Stephen killed his wife and children in stages, perhaps pausing to reflect or to summon the courage to continue his gruesome task. He first attacked his wife, Cheryl, in their bedroom, bludgeoning her with a ferocity that indicated a release of pure rage. He then moved to the children's rooms. 10-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Seth were likely the next to fall, followed by 5-year-old Mira and 3-year-old Eleanor. The act of killing a toddler with a baseball bat requires a complete suspension of humanity, a descent into a mental state where the victim is no longer a child, but an object to be removed to solve a problem. After the beatings, Stephen did not flee immediately. In a final grotesque act of cleanup or staging, he dragged the bodies to various locations within the house. Cheryl's body was found in a downstairs closet, perhaps hidden to delay discovery or to symbolize his shame. The children were found in their beds or near them, positioned in a way that suggested a twisted attempt at peacefulness. He had cleaned up some of the blood, trying to erase the physical evidence of his brutality, much like he had tried to erase the digital evidence of his embezzlement. On the morning of Easter Sunday, March 23rd, with the bodies of his family cooling in the rooms above, Stephen Sweppel walked out of the house for the last time. He did not run. He drove the same highway where he had crashed his car weeks earlier, in a grim symmetry. He crashed his vehicle again, this time intentionally slamming his Toyota 4Runner into a concrete support pillar of an overpass. The crash was violent, but it did not kill him instantly. Dazed and injured, he stumbled out of the wreckage. Police arrived on the scene quickly, finding a man in obvious distress. Before they could arrest him or ask too many questions, Stephen Sweppel made a statement that confirmed the terror waiting inside the house on Barrington Road. He told the officers, "I hurt my family." He was transported to University of Iowa hospitals and clinics with non-life-threatening injuries, while he was being treated for cuts and bruises. The police went to the Sweppel home to perform a welfare check. What they found inside the large, beautiful house was a scene of carnage that would scar even the most veteran officers. The silence of the house was broken only by the frantic radio calls of the officers discovering the bodies one by one. The news that a prominent banker had murdered his entire family on Easter Sunday sent shockwaves through Iowa City. The community grappled with the cognitive dissonance of the man they knew versus the monster he had revealed himself to be. How could a man who taught Sunday school and coached soccer do this? The answers lay in the toxic intersection of financial fraud, narcissism, and a rigid, unforgiving moral code that viewed failure as a fate worse than death. Stephen Sweppel believed, in his warped logic, that he was saving his family from the shame and disgrace of his prosecution. He convinced himself that death was a preferable alternative to seeing their father dragged through the mud and their lives upended by poverty and scandal. It was a decision made entirely without their consent, a final act of control by a man who had lost control of everything else. The aftermath of the Sweppel murders was a complex legal and emotional labyrinth. Because Stephen Sweppel died by suicide a few days after the crash, hanging himself in his hospital room using a bedsheet while under suicide watch, he never faced a court of law for his crimes. He robbed the justice system of the trial that the community demanded, and he robbed his extended family of the closure that a verdict might have provided. The investigation, however, was thorough. The Johnson County Sheriff's Office confirmed that Stephen had sent emails to the media and his family admitting to the embezzlement and the murders. In his final communications, he expressed a twisted form of remorse, claiming he loved his family too much to let them suffer the consequences of his actions. He apologized to his colleagues at the bank and to the community, but the words rang hollow in the face of such brutality. The case was closed shortly after his death, ruled a murder-suicide. The impact on the victims was absolute and tragic. Cheryl and the 4 children lost their futures, their potential snuffed out by the one person who was biologically programmed to protect them. The fact that the children were adopted made the crime even more poignant. They had already been given a second chance at a happy life with the Sweppels, only to have that hope betrayed in the most violent way imaginable. The community rallied around the extended family, holding vigils and memorial services that packed the local churches. But the stain of the event lingered over Iowa City for years. The Sweppel house stood empty for a long time, a grim reminder of the tragedy, before eventually being sold and torn down. The physical structure erased much like Stephen tried to erase his crimes. Psychologically, the case serves as a textbook example of familicide triggered by financial ruin. Unlike John List, who disappeared for decades, Stephen Sweppel's collapse was rapid and public, happening in the full light of a federal investigation. His suicide attempts prior to the murders were clear warning signs that were missed or underestimated by those around him, perhaps because he was so adept at hiding his true self. The tragedy of the Sweppel family is not just in the loss of life, but in the realization that success and stability can be a fragile illusion, masking a depth of desperation that can erupt with little warning. It forces society to question the immense pressure placed on individuals to maintain a facade of perfection, and the dangerous belief that reputation is worth more than life itself. In the end, Stephen Sweppel took the easy way out, leaving behind a legacy of pain and a pile of questions that can never be fully answered. He wanted to erase his shame, but instead he immortalized it, ensuring that the name Sweppel would forever be associated not with a respected banker, but with the Easter Sunday massacre of 2008. Number 6, Neil Entwistle, the British invader who murdered his wife and baby to escape a mountain of debt. In the quiet, gated community of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, known primarily as the starting point of the Boston Marathon, the pristine colonial house at 6 Cubs Path stood as a symbol of the American dream realized for a young couple who had crossed the Atlantic to build a new life. But the dream curdled into a nightmare on the morning of January 20th, 2006, when the bodies of Rachel Entwistle and her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian Rose, were discovered in a bloody heap in their master bedroom, revealing a crime of shocking intimacy and calculated cowardice. Neil Entwistle, a tall, soft-spoken Englishman, appeared to be the perfect husband and father, a man who had moved his family from the United Kingdom to the suburbs of Boston to pursue success in the burgeoning tech industry. But beneath the polished accent and the charming smile lay a bottomless pit of financial deceit, sexual frustration, and a crippling inability to cope with the reality of his failures. The story of Neil Entwistle is a classic study in the destructive power of the keeping up with the Joneses mentality, where the pressure to maintain a facade of wealth and success drove a man to the most heinous act imaginable, the execution of his own wife and infant child. Born in 1977 in Nottingham, England, to working-class parents, Neil was bright and ambitious, graduating from York University with a degree in electrical engineering. He met Rachel Souza, a vibrant American woman of Portuguese descent, while working in the United Kingdom. They fell in love quickly, married in 2003, and soon welcomed their daughter, Lillian. By all outward appearances, they were a beautiful, happy family. However, Neil harbored grandiose delusions of wealth that far outstripped his actual earning capacity. He was obsessed with status symbols, luxury cars, expensive watches, and a sprawling home, but he lacked the career success to legitimately afford them. After a series of failed business ventures in the UK, including a disastrous attempt to cash in on the Y2K bug that left him with nothing, Neil convinced Rachel to move to the United States, believing that the land of opportunity would be the place where he would finally strike it rich. They settled in Massachusetts, and Neil took a job as a software engineer, but his salary was nowhere near enough to sustain the lifestyle he craved. The couple purchased a house in Hopkinton, a mortgage that was immediately suffocating, and Neil bought a BMW, adding to their monthly burdens. As the debts mounted, Neil did not cut back. He dug deeper. He began engaging in fraudulent schemes, using his father's identity to secure credit lines and maxing out credit cards to pay for groceries and utilities. He secretly purchased a list of thousands of email addresses and attempted to launch a spam business selling erectile dysfunction pills, a seedy venture that produced zero profit, but required significant investment. He also retreated into a dark fantasy world online, frequenting adult websites and escort services, looking for sexual thrills that his marriage perhaps lacked, fueled by a deep-seated insecurity and a desire for validation. By January 2006, the house of cards was collapsing. The couple was over $10,000 in arrears on their mortgage, their credit was ruined, and their cars were days away from being repossessed. Neil was unemployed, having quit his job to focus on his failed internet schemes, a fact he hid from Rachel and their families. He felt the walls closing in, the shame of his failures looming large, and in his mind, there was only one way out: to erase the life he had built and start over, free from the burden of his wife and child. The events of January 20th, 2006, began with a lie. Neil told Rachel that he was going out to run errands, a routine occurrence that aroused no suspicion. Instead, he drove to a local gun store, where he purchased a .22 caliber revolver. He had been researching firearms online, another secret habit, and now he had the means to carry out his dark plan. He returned to the house at 6 Cubs Path, the silent, cold home where his wife and baby were waiting. What happened inside the master bedroom that afternoon is a scene of almost unfathomable brutality. Neil entered the room where Rachel was lying on the bed with Lillian, perhaps nursing her or cuddling her. Without a word, without a discussion of their financial ruin or a plea for help, Neil raised a gun and shot Rachel in the head. The bullet entered her brain, killing her almost instantly, but the violence did not end there. In a moment of calculated, heartless cruelty, Neil then turned the gun on his 9-month-old daughter, Lillian. He shot the baby in the chest, ending her life before she had even learned to walk. He then shot Rachel a second time, in the torso, an act of overkill that suggests a desperate need to ensure his targets were truly silenced. Having slaughtered his family, Neil did not call the police or an ambulance. He did not crumble in grief. Instead, he methodically staged a scene to make it appear as if Rachel had committed suicide and taken the baby with her. He placed a gun in Rachel's hand, trying to force her dead fingers around the grip, a clumsy forensic ploy that would easily be debunked by investigators. He then dragged the bodies onto the bed, pulling the comforter up to cover them, hiding his handiwork from the world. He cleaned up the blood as best he could and gathered a few belongings. Later that afternoon, Neil picked up a rental car he had booked and loaded it with some of Rachel's jewelry, his passport, and the couple's laptop computer. He drove to Logan International Airport, abandoned his own car in the parking lot, and boarded a flight to London, leaving his dead wife and daughter in the darkened bedroom. He was fleeing to the UK, to the safety of his parents' home, intending to leave his life of debt and murder behind him. The discovery of the bodies fell upon the shoulders of Rachel's mother, Priscilla Matarazzo, and stepfather, Joseph Matarazzo. Worried because they hadn't heard from Rachel in over a day, and because Neil had been evasive, they drove to Hopkinton House on the evening of January 21st, 2006. They found the house unlocked and the master bedroom door closed. When they opened the door, they were met with the grisly sight of Rachel and Lillian lying dead under the covers. The police were called immediately, and the homicide investigation was launched with lightning speed. It didn't take long for the narrative to unravel. Forensic technicians quickly determined that Rachel had not shot herself. The angle of the wound and the lack of gunshot residue on her hands made suicide impossible. Furthermore, the gun was registered to Neil's father-in-law, Joseph Matarazzo, but Neil had been the one to pick it up from a gun shop days earlier. The motive became clear when investigators delved into the Entwistle's finances. They found a mountain of debt, eviction notices, and canceled checks for pornographic websites and escort services. The computer seized from the home revealed Neil's desperate internet searches for how to kill people and suicide methods, as well as his pathetic get-rich-quick schemes. The portrait painted was not of a devoted husband driven to madness, but a cold, calculating coward who killed his family to escape the consequences of his own incompetence and greed. The manhunt went international. Neil Entwistle was located at his parents' home in Worksop, Nottinghamshire, England. He was arrested by British police on February 9, 2006, approximately 2 weeks after the murders. He offered no resistance, claiming that he returned to UK to grieve and that he found his wife dead in panic due to his illegal immigration status, a lie that crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. The extradition process became a major diplomatic event, with Neil fighting to stay in the UK, likely fearing the harsher American justice system. However, the British courts agreed to his extradition, and he was flown back to Massachusetts in July 2006 to face trial. The trial of Neil Entwistle began in June 2008 in Middlesex Superior Court, a proceeding that gripped the public with its mix of sex, money, and murder. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Fabry, laid out a devastating case, arguing that Neil killed his wife and child because he was thousands of dollars in debt, unhappy in his marriage, and unwilling to face the humiliation of his failures. They presented evidence of his secret life, his financial ruin, and his flight to England as proof of consciousness of guilt. The medical examiner took the stand and detailed the autopsies, describing the trajectory of the bullets and confirming that Rachel could not have held the gun. The defense, led by Elliot Weinstein, attempted to cast doubt on forensic evidence, suggesting that the police mishandled the crime scene and that there was a lack of direct eyewitnesses placing the gun in Neil's hand. In a shocking move, the defense actually argued that Rachel, driven by postpartum depression or some other mental break, had killed the baby and then herself, and that Neil had merely found them in panic due to his undocumented status. This theory was widely seen as desperate and offensive, given the complete lack of evidence supporting Rachel's instability and the physical impossibility of the scenario. The jury was not swayed by the defense's attempts to smear the victim. They deliberated for less than a day before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. 2 count of first-degree murder, 1 count of illegal possession of firearm, and 1 count of illegal possession of ammunition. The sentencing phase was swift. The mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Massachusetts is life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Diane Cotmere imposed a sentence, condemning Neil to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. She addressed him directly, noting that he had taken the lives of two beautiful people who trusted him implicitly, all for the sake of money and his own ego. Neil Entwistle is currently serving his sentence at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Cedar Junction, a maximum security prison. He has maintained his innocence from behind bars, even filing appeals that have been subsequently denied, continuing to cling to the lies that defined his life. His parents in the UK have stood by him, a tragic display of parental denial. But Rachel's family has been left to pick up the pieces of a shattered existence. The case of Neil Entwistle resonates because it dismantles the myth of the perfect life. It shows that the smiling man next door, the doting father in the photos, can be harboring a monster. The murder of Lillian Rose, a baby who had barely begun to live, is particularly heartbreaking and serves as the central emotional anchor of the tragedy. Neil Entwistle didn't just kill his family. He tried to kill his own failures, burying them in a bloody bed in Massachusetts. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface, and now, instead of a successful entrepreneur living in a gated community, Neil Entwistle is just another number in the prison system, a reminder that no matter how far you run, you cannot escape the consequences of your own evil. The house at 6 Cubs Path has since been sold, a new family living within its walls. But the shadow of the crime remains a permanent scar on the history of Hopkinton. The story serves as a grim warning about the dangers of living beyond one's means and the catastrophic lengths to which some will go to protect an image that is nothing more than a hollow shell. Number 7. Jeffrey MacDonald, the Green Beret doctor whose fatal vision became a reality. In the early hours of February 17, 1970, the military police of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, responded to a frantic phone call from 544 Castle Drive, arriving at a scene of incomprehensible carnage that would ignite one of the most controversial, litigious, and famously debated murder cases in American history, a case that pitted a handsome, charismatic Green Beret doctor against the might of the United States Army and the federal justice system for nearly 5 decades. Jeffrey MacDonald, a 26-year-old Army captain and surgeon, was found on the floor of the master bedroom, clad only in his pajama tops, suffering from stab wounds and a concussion, while the bodies of his pregnant wife, Colette, and his 2 young daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen, lay brutally murdered in adjacent rooms. MacDonald immediately told the MPs a tale of horror that seemed ripped from the headlines of the Manson family murders which had terrified the nation just months prior. He claimed that 4 intruders, 3 men and a woman wearing a blonde wig and floppy hat, had chanted, "Acid is groovy," and killed the pigs as they attacked his family with ice picks and knives. He described a violent struggle in the living room where he was knocked unconscious, claiming he awoke to find his family slaughtered. The initial investigation by the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID, was swift but fraught with confusion and the potential for compromised evidence due to the emergency medical response and the on-scene chaos. However, as the investigators combed to the bloody apartment, discrepancies began to emerge that contradicted the hippie cult narrative MacDonald was selling. The crime scene was oddly contained. While MacDonald claimed a massive fight had taken place in the living room, very little blood was found there, casting doubt on his story of being bludgeoned amidst a violent brawl. Instead, the most significant blood evidence was found in the bedrooms where the victims lay. Furthermore, the bodies of Colette and the children revealed a pattern of violence that suggested personal rage rather than a frenzied, disorganized attack of a drug-crazed mob. Colette had been beaten severely with a club, determined to be a piece of lumber from Kimberly's bed, and stabbed 37 times with a knife and an ice pick, including wounds that were defensive in nature on her arms, indicating she had fought for her life. Little Kimberly had been bludgeoned in the head with such force that her skull was fractured and stabbed in the neck, while baby Kristen was stabbed 33 times in the chest with an ice pick and a knife. The brutality was staggering. Yet MacDonald, who claimed to have engaged these killers, had only relatively minor injuries: a punctured lung, a concussion, and a small stab wound on his chest that forensic experts would later argue could have been self-inflicted. As the investigation deepened, the physical evidence began to weave a web around the young doctor. Crucially, fibers from MacDonald's torn pajama top were found in Kimberly's room, a detail that completely contradicted his story. MacDonald claimed he had put his pajama top over Colette after discovering her body to keep her warm. Yet fibers from that same garment were found under Kimberly's body and caught in the bedspread of the crib where Kristen was murdered. This implied that MacDonald had been wearing the pajama top in the children's rooms during the attacks, directly refuting his claim that he was unconscious in the living room. Additionally, a splinter of wood from the murder weapon, the broken piece of bed rail, was found in the bedroom, linking the weapon to the household itself, not to intruders. The words "pig" were written in blood on the headboard of the master bed, a clear attempt to mimic the Manson murders and reinforce the narrative of hippie intruders. The CID investigators, led by Colonel William Kearns, became increasingly skeptical of MacDonald's account, noting his calm demeanor and his detailed, rehearsed-sounding recollections of the event despite his claimed head injury. However, due to a lack of definitive forensic technology at the time and the powerful influence of MacDonald's father-in-law, Freddie Kassab, who initially defended him, the Army charges against MacDonald were eventually dropped by his commanding general in October 1970 due to insufficient evidence. MacDonald was honorably discharged from the Army and returned to civilian life, moving to California to resume his medical career, seemingly escaping the shadow of suspicion. For the next 4 years, the case lay dormant, but it was far from closed. Freddie Kassab, who had been MacDonald's staunchest supporter, began to experience a crisis of conscience. As he reviewed the evidence and listened to MacDonald's varying accounts of that night, the story began to unravel for him. He realized that MacDonald's narrative was physically impossible, particularly regarding the movement of the pajama top and the lack of a struggle in the living room. Kassab became a man possessed, dedicating his life to ensuring that MacDonald faced justice. He bombarded the Army, the Justice Department, and politicians with letters and pleas for a reinvestigation. His persistence finally paid off when the case was referred to the Department of Justice. A grand jury was convened in 1974, and after hearing testimony from forensic experts who re-examined the evidence, particularly the fiber transfers and the trajectory of the ice pick wounds, Jeffrey MacDonald was indicted for the murders of his wife and daughters. He was arrested in California in January 1975 and extradited to North Carolina to stand trial. The trial, which began in 1979, was a media sensation. The prosecution, led by James Blackburn and Brian Murtaugh, methodically dismantled MacDonald's story using the physical evidence. They brought in experts who demonstrated how the blood splatter patterns proved Colette was beaten while lying on the floor, not standing as MacDonald claimed, and how the ice pick wounds in her chest were delivered with a downward force consistent with someone standing over her. They highlighted the U-shape of the pajama top, which MacDonald claimed was wrapped around his wrist during the struggle, but which the prosecution argued was used as a weapon to bludgeon Colette, evidenced by the blood patterns matching the garment. The defense, led by Bernard Siegel, attacked the credibility of the CID's investigation, suggesting the evidence was lost or mishandled, and centered their case around the potential existence of the intruders MacDonald described. They called Helena Stokely, a troubled local woman, who resembled the description of the female intruder, to the stand. Stokely had a history of drug use and mental instability, and over the years she had confessed to being at the house on the night of the murders, though her confessions were inconsistent and often contradictory. However, when placed on the stand, Stokely recanted, claiming she had no memory of being there and that she had been coached by defense attorneys. The jury also heard from MacDonald himself, whose testimony came across as arrogant and evasive. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Jeffrey MacDonald guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison. The aftermath of the trial did not end the legal saga. In fact, it was only the beginning of a new chapter. MacDonald's case became a cultural phenomenon with the publication of Joe McGinnis's book, Fatal Vision, in 1983, which portrayed MacDonald as a narcissistic psychopath who killed his family in a rage fueled by amphetamine use and a desire to be free of the burdens of domestic life. MacDonald sued McGinnis for breach of privacy, a case that brought the ethics of true crime journalism into the national spotlight. Meanwhile, MacDonald continued to file appeals, alleging that the prosecution had withheld exculpatory evidence, specifically regarding Stokely and a potential blonde hair found in Colette's hand that did not match MacDonald or the victims. For decades, his legal team argued that Stokely and her drug-fueled associates were the real killers and that the government had engaged in a malicious prosecution to cover up the lack of a thorough investigation into the hippie theory. In the 1980s and 90s, MacDonald gained a new generation of supporters, including author Errol Morris, who wrote A Wilderness of Error, arguing that McDonald was railroaded by a biased justice system. However, the courts consistently rejected these appeals. In 1992, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the conviction, ruling that the evidence against McDonald was overwhelming. The most significant blow to McDonald's claims came in the 2000s with the advent of advanced DNA testing. McDonald had fought for years to have DNA evidence from the crime scene tested, confident it would point to intruders. The results, finally released in the mid-2000s, were devastating to his case. DNA from a hair found in Colette's hand was found to be consistent with McDonald himself, not an intruder. Mitochondrial DNA from a hair found on a hairbrush in the bathroom matched a profile consistent with McDonald or his children, not Stokely or any unknown female. In 2010, a federal judge granted McDonald a new hearing based on the claims of withheld evidence, specifically regarding Stokely's statements to prosecutors. However, after a series of heated hearings, the judge ruled in 2012 that even if Stokely's testimony had been admitted, it would not have changed the verdict given the strength of the physical evidence. In 2018, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals denied his request for a new trial, and in 2020, the Supreme Court declined to hear his case, effectively ending his legal avenues for appeal. Jeffrey McDonald remains incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina, now an elderly man in his 80s, still maintaining his innocence and still fighting for his freedom through civil lawsuits, while the families of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen continue to endure the pain of their loss, exacerbated by the decades of litigation and McDonald's refusal to accept responsibility. The case of Jeffrey McDonald stands as a stark example of the complexity of forensic science and the enduring power of a charismatic sociopath to manipulate public perception. It is a story of a man who had everything: a prestigious career, a beautiful family, and a bright future, who threw it all away in a moment of explosive violence, then spent the rest of his life constructing an elaborate alternative reality to hide the truth. The fatal vision of that night in 1970 was not a hallucination caused by intruders, but a reflection of the darkness within Jeffrey McDonald himself, a darkness that destroyed a family and captivated a nation, proving that justice may be delayed, but it is not always denied. The tragedy at 544. Castle Drive serves as a grim reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we invite into our homes, and that the facade of the Golden Boy can hide a heart capable of the most unforgivable crimes against the innocent. Number 8. Mark Barton. The day trader who lost his fortune and took out his rage on his family and the world. In the sweltering heat of July 1999, the city of Atlanta was buzzing with the electric energy of the dot-com boom, a time when the stock market seemed like a limitless fountain of wealth for those daring enough to play the game. But for Mark Orrin Barton, the glittering promise of the financial markets had morphed into a predatory trap that would trigger one of the most horrific sprees of violence in American history, combining the intimate horror of family annihilation with the public terror of a mass shooting. Barton was not a career criminal or a hardened thug. He was a chemist, a quiet man who appeared to be a devoted father to his 2 children, Matthew and Michelle, and a loving husband to his second wife, Lee Ann. However, beneath the veneer of suburban stability lay a turbulent history marked by suspicion, financial obsession, and a dark capacity for violence that had allegedly claimed a victim years before the Atlanta massacre. To understand the explosion of violence on July 29, 1999, one must look back 6 years to 1993 in Sheffield, Alabama, where Barton's first wife, Deborah, was found beaten to death in her home. The weapon was a hammer, and the brutality of the attack shocked the local community. Mark Barton was a prime suspect. He had been the last person to see her alive, and his demeanor was disturbingly detached. However, due to a lack of conclusive physical evidence and botched crime scene work, he was never charged. He collected a substantial life insurance payout and moved on, leaving the shadow of suspicion hanging over him like a storm cloud. He eventually remarried and moved his new family to the Atlanta suburbs, attempting to reinvent himself as a successful day trader. Day trading in the late 1990s was a cultural phenomenon, a modern gold rush where ordinary citizens believed they could quit their jobs and make millions from their computers. Barton was seduced by this lifestyle. He set up a trading station in his home and later began frequenting 2 day trading firms in the Buckhead district of Atlanta, All Tech Investment Group and Momentum Securities. At first, he seemed to have a knack for it, but the market is a fickle mistress, and as the volatility increased, Barton's luck turned. By the summer of 1999, he had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, money he didn't have. He had sunk his family's savings into the market and borrowed heavily from his mother and others to cover his margins, digging a financial hole that was deep enough to bury him. The stress of the mounting debts, combined with the shame of his failure and the fear of exposing his inadequacy to his wife, began to fracture Barton's psyche. He withdrew from his family, becoming moody and despondent, his mind fixated on the numbers on the screen that represented his undoing. The descent into madness began in the days leading up to the massacre. Barton, sensing the end was near, purchased a hammer and a 9mm handgun. On the night of July 27, 1999, while his children slept and his wife relaxed in their home in the Atlanta suburb of Morrow, Georgia, the darkness within him finally took over. He attacked Leanne first, bludgeoning her with a hammer, in a fit of rage that mirrored the death of his first wife. He then turned his attention to his children. 11-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Michelle were defenseless against their father's strength. He beat them with the same horrific brutality, extinguishing their young lives in the sanctuary of their home. After the bludgeoning, in a final act of depravity, he stabbed them to ensure they were dead. The scene in the Morrow house was a tableau of butchery that would haunt the first responders who found it days later. Having slaughtered his family, Barton did not immediately flee. He stayed in the house with the bodies for hours, perhaps trying to reconcile what he had done, or perhaps preparing himself for the next phase of his plan. He scribbled out a series of notes, rambling manifestos that blamed his actions on his financial failures and his inability to stop trading. In one note he wrote, "I killed my children and Leanne because they were the only things in this world I ever truly loved," a perverse justification that suggested he viewed murder as an act of mercy, saving them from the shame of his ruin. He also expressed a desire to kill the people he felt were responsible for his losses, the brokers and the market itself. On the morning of July 29, 1999, Mark Barton drove his van from the blood-soaked house in Morrow to the upscale office park in Buckhead, parking between the two day trading offices where he had suffered his financial defeats. He was armed with 2 handguns, the 9mm and a .45 caliber pistol. He walked into the All-Tech Investment Group office first. The room was filled with the clatter of keyboards and the murmurs of traders staring at ticker tapes. No one noticed Barton until he pulled out the 9mm and began shooting methodically at the people sitting at their terminals. The first shots rang out like a crack of thunder, causing chaos to erupt instantly. Traders dove under desks, screaming and scrambling for the exits. Barton moved through the room with a calm, terrifying demeanor, shooting people in the head and chest. He killed 4 people in All-Tech and wounded several others, his face devoid of emotion, as if he were merely closing out losing positions. He left that office and crossed the street to Momentum Securities. The panic had spread by now, but the Momentum traders had little time to react before Barton entered and opened fire again. He killed 5 more people in the second location, continuing his cold-blooded execution of strangers who had nothing to do with his personal losses other than being present in the environment where he had failed. The police response was massive, with SWAT teams descending on the area within minutes. But Barton managed to slip away in confusion, melting into the traffic of Atlanta. The city was paralyzed with fear. An active shooter was on the loose, having murdered 9 people and injured 13 more in broad daylight. The manhunt was intense, with helicopters scanning the freeways and roadblocks set up across the metro area. For several hours, Barton disappeared, leading to a frantic search that extended into the neighboring counties. However, the weight of his crimes, the slaughter of his wife and children discovered back in Morrow, and the massacre in the office buildings, was too much to bear. Later that evening, police tracked his white van to a gas station in Ackworth, a suburb north of Atlanta. When officers approached the vehicle, Barton was inside. He refused to surrender, and as the negotiations began, he took his own life by shooting himself in the head, ending the terror but denying the victims' families the satisfaction of seeing him face justice. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the tragedy. When police entered the Barton home in Morrow, they found the bodies of Leanne, Matthew, and Michelle, along with the handwritten notes that confessed to the murders. The discovery also prompted authorities in Alabama to reopen the case of Deborah Barton, his first wife. While Bart was dead and could not be tried for that crime, the physical evidence and the similar MO, bludgeoning with a hammer, strongly suggested that he had gotten away with murder once before, only to repeat the cycle 6 years later on a much grander scale. The case of Mark Barton sent shockwaves through the day trading community and sparked a national conversation about the psychological pressures of high-risk finance and the easy access to firearms. It highlighted the dangerous intersection of mental health crises and financial ruin, a toxic cocktail that can turn a desperate man into a mass murderer. For the families of the office workers who were simply going about their jobs, and for the relatives of Leanne and her children, the loss was immeasurable. Barton's attempt to frame his narrative as one of man pushed to the brink by unfair markets was rejected by the public, who saw him as a coward who chose death and murder over accountability. The legacy of Mark Barton is written in the blood of 12 people whose lives were cut short because one man could not cope with his own failures. It serves as a grim reminder that the most volatile element in the stock market is not the economy, but the human mind, and that when the illusion of success shatters, the fallout can be catastrophic for everyone in the vicinity. The events of July 1999 remain a scar on the city of Atlanta, a day when the violence of the home spilled out into the street, fueled by the lethal combination of untreated rage and financial desperation. Number 9, John Battaglia, the revenge murder heard over phone. The story of John David Battaglia is a harrowing chronicle of domestic terror that culminated in one of the most visceral and heart-wrenching acts of familial violence in modern American history, a crime defined not just by the physical act of murder, but by the sadistic psychological torture inflicted upon the children's mother in the moments before their deaths. On May 2, 2001, in a trendy loft apartment in the Deep Ellum district of Dallas, Texas, 46-year-old John Battaglia transformed from a divorced father into a monster, using his 2 young daughters, 9-year-old Liberty and 6-year-old Faith, as pawns of a final, grotesque act of vengeance against his estranged wife, Mary Jean Pearl. To understand the magnitude of this atrocity, one must peel back the layers of Battaglia's life to reveal a long-standing pattern of misogynistic violence, legal failures, and a volatile temper that the justice system failed to contain. Battaglia was not a man who snapped suddenly. He was a ticking time bomb who had been given repeated chances to detonate. Born in 1955, Battaglia was a successful accountant, a man who presented a facade of charm and professionalism to the world. But behind closed doors, he was a tyrant driven by a pathological need to control the women in his life. His history of violence predated his marriage to Mary Jean Pearl. In 1987, he was charged with aggravated assault against his first wife, Nancy. In a chilling precursor to the 2001 murders, he had forced Nancy to remove her clothes, shot her twice in the back with a .357 Magnum, and then left her for dead in a parking lot. Miraculously, she survived, but the legal system's response to this near homicide was appallingly lenient. Battaglia pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and received a sentence of 10 years probation, a slap on the wrist that allowed him to walk free and continue his life with minimal consequence. This failure to incapacitate a violent predator set the stage for the tragedy that would unfold 14 years later. Battaglia met Mary Jean Pearl in the early 1990s, and they married in 1995. For a time, the relationship seemed normal, and they welcomed 2 daughters, Liberty and Faith, who became the center of Mary Jean's world. However, as the marriage progressed, the charming accountant vanished, replaced by a controlling, abusive abuser. Battaglia's rages were unpredictable and terrifying. He would scream at Mary Jean for hours, monitor her every move, and isolate her from her friends and family. The physical abuse began gradually, shoving, grabbing, and slapping, before escalating into more violent assaults. Mary Jean, terrified for her safety and the safety of her children, filed for divorce in 1999. The separation only fueled Battaglia's rage. He viewed his wife's departure as a betrayal that warranted punishment. The divorce proceedings were contentious and drawn out, marked by Battaglia's refusal to accept the end of the marriage. He was ordered to attend anger management classes, a court-mandated attempt to curb his temper that he treated as a joke, often skipping sessions or mocking the instructors. Despite the protection orders and the documented history of abuse, the custody arrangement allowed Battaglia unsupervised visitation with the girls, a legal loophole that he would eventually exploit with fatal consequences. In the months leading up to May 2001, Battaglia's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was convinced that Mary Jean was turning his daughters against him, a paranoid delusion that festered in his mind. He left threatening messages on her answer machine, screaming that he would ruin her life. He used the children as messengers, delivering verbal abuse through them. Mary Jean, living in fear, did everything she could to comply with court orders, hoping that if she gave him what he wanted, his anger would subside. She did not know that she was dealing with a man whose endgame was not custody, but total destruction. The day of the murders, May 2nd, 2001, began like any other court-order visitation day. Battaglia picked up Liberty and Faith from school for dinner. Mary Jean expected to have them back later that evening. But a series of ominous events began to unfold. Battaglia took the girls to his loft apartment, a space he had decorated with his own artwork, trying to project an image of the cool, artistic bachelor. Sometime after arriving, he called Mary Jean. It was around 6 p.m. When Mary Jean answered the phone, Battaglia's voice was filled with malevolent glee. He asked her if she had spoken to their daughters lately. When she said she hadn't, he told her to say hello to them. He put the phone down, but didn't hang up. Mary Jean heard the rustling of the phone being placed on a table or counter, followed by the sound of footsteps. Then, the terrified voices of her daughters filled the line. They were crying, frightened, sensing the dark mood of their father. "Mommy, why do you want Daddy to go to jail?" they asked, a question clearly fed to them by Battaglia to twist a knife. Mary Jean, confused and alarmed, tried to reassure them, but Battaglia grabbed the phone back. "Happy Mother's Day," he sneered. Then came the words that would haunt Mary Jean forever. "Why don't you talk to your daughters? You're not going to talk to them again." In the background, Mary Jean heard Liberty scream, "No, Daddy, no, don't do it," followed by the unmistakable, horrific sound of gunfire. Bang, bang, silence. Then the sound of the other daughter, Faith, pleading for her life, followed by more gunshots. Bang, bang. The line went dead. Mary Jean, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what she had just witnessed, called 911, her hysterical pleas to the dispatcher. "He just shot them. I heard him shoot them," over the phone, became the permanent audio record of a mother's worst nightmare. While Mary Jean was on the phone with emergency services, the chaos at Battaglia's loft was unfolding. After firing multiple rounds into his daughters, hitting young Faith in the back and Liberty in the chest, Battaglia walked out of his apartment and sat on a ledge outside, smoking a cigarette. He had no intention of fleeing. He was waiting for the police, almost as if he had completed a mission. When Dallas police officers arrived at the scene, they found the loft in disarray. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Liberty and Faith lying in a pool of blood. Faith was still clinging to life, though barely, and was rushed to the hospital, where she died a short time later. The officers confronted Battaglia outside. He was surprisingly calm, his demeanor detached and indifferent. He offered no resistance as they handcuffed him and placed him in the back of a squad car. When asked if he had a weapon, he flippantly told them about a gun inside. He showed no remorse, no tears, and no realization of the magnitude of what he had done. In fact, according to officers at the scene, he seemed almost satisfied, a man who had finally exacted the ultimate revenge on the woman who dared to leave him. The investigation was straightforward, as Battaglia made no effort to deny his actions. He was arrested and charged with capital murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The 911 call recording, which captured the final moments of the girls' lives and the sound of the gunshots, the murder weapon recovered at the scene, and his own presence at the location immediately following the crime. The focus quickly shifted to the legal proceedings, where the prosecution had the unenviable task of seeking the death penalty for a man who had slaughtered his own children. The trial began in 2002, and the courtroom atmosphere was thick with tension and sorrow. Mary Jean Pearl testified with a courage that defied comprehension. She recounted the years of abuse and the horrific phone call, forcing the jury to relive her trauma. The audio recording was played in court, a sound so chilling that it reduced jurors and spectators to tears. The prosecution argued that this was not a crime of passion or a momentary lapse of sanity, but a calculated act of revenge designed to inflict maximum pain on Mary Jean Pearl. They highlighted the 1987 shooting of his first wife to establish a pattern of behavior, proving that Battaglia was a habitual offender of domestic violence who graduated from attempted murder to actual murder. They painted a picture of a narcissist who believed that his wife and children were his property, to be disposed of when they no longer serve his ego. The defense team attempted to save Battaglia's life by arguing that he was suffering from severe mental illness and drug addiction. They claimed he was bipolar and was in the midst of a manic episode induced by steroid use and alcohol. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified that Battaglia's brain was chemically imbalanced and that he lacked the intent to kill, claiming he was in a dissociative state. They also pointed to his own childhood, describing an abusive father who had beaten him, attempting to evoke sympathy for the cycle of violence. However, the prosecution dismantled this narrative. They called their own experts who testified that while Battaglia may have had personality disorders, he knew exactly what he was doing. The meticulous nature of the crime, calling his wife first, forcing the girls to speak to her, and then shooting them, demonstrated a clear, rational sequence of actions driven by hate, not insanity. The jury saw through the defense's attempt to shift the blame to mental illness. After deliberating for just over 3 hours, they found John Battaglia guilty of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, Mary Jean Pearl delivered a victim impact statement that was a powerful indictment of both Battaglia and the system that failed her daughters. She looked him in the eye and told him that he was a coward and a monster. On April 30th, 2002, John Battaglia was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For the next 16 years, Battaglia resided on death row at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. He exhausted his appeals, his lawyers arguing various technicalities, but convictions held firm. While on death row, he gave interviews showing no remorse, continuing to blame Mary Jean for the state of his life and maintaining his narcissistic facade. He became a symbol of the ultimate domestic abuser, a man who used the legal system to prolong his life even as he denied his children any future. Finally, on February 1st, 2018, the state of Texas carried out the sentence. John Battaglia was executed at the Huntsville unit. In his final statement, he did not apologize to his daughters or to Mary Jean. Instead, he rambled incoherently, saying, "I guess this is the price you pay for being an electrician. I just want everyone to know I did not kill my children. I love my children." It was a final, insultingly dishonest lie from a man who had never told the truth. Mary Jean Pearl witnessed the execution, sitting stoically as the man who tortured her took his last breath. She later stated that she felt a sense of relief, but that the pain of losing liberty and faith would never truly go away. The legacy of John Battaglia is a tragic warning about the lethality of domestic violence and the critical importance of enforcing protective orders and taking threats seriously. His ability to manipulate the system, his history of getting away with violence, and his ultimate act of slaughtering his children to punish his wife serve as a grim reminder that the most dangerous place for many women and children is within their own homes. The echoes of the gunshots heard over that phone call continue to resonate as a call to action for advocates and lawmakers fighting to break the cycle of abuse and prevent another mother from enduring the unspeakable horror that Mary Jean Pearl faced that dark night in Dallas. Number 10, Christopher Watts, the oil field worker who buried his family in the earth he worked. The case of Christopher Lee Watts is a modern digital age tragedy that unfolded in the bright light of social media, where the Watts family presented an image of picture-perfect domestic bliss to their thousands of followers on Facebook, a curated existence of family vacations, happy pregnancy announcements, and hashtag love notes that masked a crumbling marriage, a secret double life, and a cold-blooded determination to start over by erasing the family he had built. On August 13th, 2018, in the quiet suburban town of Frederick, Colorado, the world watched in horror as the search for a missing pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters turned into a confession of familicide that defied comprehension in its brutality and its betrayal of parental instinct. Christopher Watts was a 33-year-old mechanic and operator for Anadarko Petroleum, a man who appeared to be a devoted husband to Shannon Watts, a 34-year-old successful salesperson for a multi-level marketing company called Lavelle, and a doting father to their 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, with a 3rd child, a son named Nico, On the way, to their friends and neighbors, the Watts family were thrivers, living a life of abundance in their newly built 5-bedroom home. But the reality behind the closed doors was far more toxic. The marriage had been deteriorating for months, suffocated by financial strain and Christopher's emotional withdrawal. Shannon, who was the primary breadwinner and managed a household with a type A intensity, grew increasingly frustrated with Chris's lack of ambition and his refusal to engage in family life, while Chris felt suffocated by her demands and the responsibilities of fatherhood. The breaking point came in the summer of 2018 when Christopher, seeking an escape from his domestic unhappiness, began an affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. Infatuated with the freedom and novelty of the new relationship, Christopher began a calculated exit strategy from his marriage. In the weeks leading up to the murders, he secretly transferred money to a new bank account, looked up engagement rings online for his mistress, and surfed the web for questions about how to rewire surveillance cameras and how to disappear, a digital footprint of premeditation that he foolishly believed he could erase. The fatal day began in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. Shauna Watts returned home from a business trip to Arizona around 2 a.m. She was exhausted, pregnant, and unaware that her husband had spent the weekend with his mistress and had decided that the only way out of his life was to murder his family. The argument that ensued in the master bedroom was the final nail in the coffin. Christopher claimed later that he snapped when Shannon threatened to take the children and never let him see them again, but the forensic evidence suggested a much more calculated act. He strangled Shannon to death on the bed, his hands squeezing the life out of the woman who had dedicated years to building their life together. She was 15 weeks pregnant with her son, Nico, who also died in the assault. With his wife dead, Christopher was faced with the terrified reality of his 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, who were asleep in their rooms down the hall. He could have called for help at that moment, claimed a crime of passion, and perhaps spared their lives, but the darkness had fully consumed him. He loaded the 2 little girls into his work truck, telling them that Mommy was sick and they were going to see her. He drove them to the remote Survey 319 oil work site where he was employed, a desolate industrial landscape dotted with heavy machinery and storage tanks. It was there in the bed of his truck amidst the dust and oil that Christopher Watts committed the most unforgivable acts of his life. He smothered Celeste first, then turned to Bella. In a detail that would emerge during his confession and later cause a tsunami of public grief, Bella reportedly looked at her father and asked, "Daddy, please don't do to me what you did to Mommy," a plea that went unheeded as he extinguished her life. He then dumped their small bodies into the crude oil tanks used to store the byproducts of drilling, burying them in the sludge to hide his crimes. After returning home with his truck empty, Christopher Watts embarked on a performance of grief that would be captured on police body cameras and broadcast to the world. He called the police that afternoon to report Shannon and the children missing, feigning confusion and panic. When officers arrived, he acted the part of the worried husband, pacing the floor, wringing his hands, and suggesting that Shannon might have taken the girls and left him, perhaps upset about their recent financial troubles. The deception was chilling in its conviction. He sat in the living room with a neighbor, wiping away fake tears, while the bodies of his wife and children were soaking in oil a few miles away. The investigation moved quickly, largely due to Shannon's friend, who went to the house when she couldn't reach her and became suspicious of Christopher's behavior. As the police gathered evidence, the cracks in Christopher's story widened. The surveillance footage from a neighbor's house showed him backing his truck into the garage, a behavior inconsistent with his claim that Shannon had left with the children. His phone records revealed text messages to his mistress that contradicted his timeline. Finally, the police pressured him to take a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. It was during the subsequent interrogation by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, led by Agent Tammy Lee, that the facade finally crumbled. Confronted with the inconsistencies and the mountain of evidence against him, Christopher Watts dropped the act. In a monotone voice, devoid of emotion, he confessed to killing Shannon. He claimed it was an accident, a rage-fueled moment, but the admission of killing the children followed shortly after. He told the investigators where to find the bodies, leading them to the oil site. When the authorities recovered Bella and Celeste from the tanks, the community of Frederick and the world at large was plunged into mourning. The discovery that a father could not only kill his wife, but methodically murder his own children was a blow to the collective psyche. The legal proceedings for Christopher Watts were swift, largely because he chose to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. In November 2018, he pleaded guilty to 9 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The plea deal was controversial, as it guaranteed he would spend life in prison without the possibility of parole, rather than facing execution, a decision made to spare the families the trauma of a lengthy trial and to ensure he could never appeal his convictions. During the sentencing hearing, the court heard victim impact statements from Shanann's family, who described the immeasurable pain of losing Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn Nico in one swoop of violence. Shanann's parents, Sandra and Frank Razusek, spoke of the void left behind and the betrayal of trust. Christopher Watts offered a brief, hollow apology, claiming he loved his family and that he didn't know why he did it, a statement that rang false to everyone in the courtroom. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, plus an additional 84 years for the tampering charges, ensuring he will die in prison. Following his sentencing, Watts was transferred out of Colorado, first to a prison in Wisconsin to be closer to his parents, though he remains a pariah even among the prison population. The case of Christopher Watts serves as a grim cautionary tale about the illusion of perfection and the hidden dangers that can lurk behind a smiling social media profile. It highlighted the lethal potential of domestic violence when a partner decides that their own happiness is worth more than the lives of their family. The deaths of Bella and Celeste, often referred to as the little angels, became a rallying cry for awareness about coercive control and the red flags of spousal abuse. The oil tanks where he dumped their bodies were demolished, and the house where the murders occurred was sold. The physical scars erased, but the memory of that August day lingers. It is a story of a man who wanted a do-over on his life and was willing to commit the ultimate evil to get it, only to find himself condemned to a cage, alone with his guilt, while the world remembers him only as the monster who killed his family. The tragedy of the Watts family is not just in the loss of life, but in the betrayal of the fundamental promise of parenthood, to protect and nurture. Christopher Watts broke that promise in the most violent way possible, leaving behind a legacy of heartbreak and a community that will never be the same.